because it's gonna be a heavy piece. Some dark poetry coming your way. Alright, the title of this piece is called No Evil. It's based off of the Three Wise Monkeys, or Three Foolish Monkeys, whatever you want to call them. And it's a domestic abuse piece, so bear with me. I grew up learning not to see any evil, but my mother would always tell me to squeeze my eyes shut, place my head down against my chest, and hide it behind my arms every time my father rose his hand up against her. And she would later tell me, "We're just playing a game, honey. This is just something that adults do between each other within the privacy of their own homes." Thus, I grew up learning not to see the evil of my father's love towards my mother as he brought the leather straps down on her head, shoulders, and back, leaving her as nothing more than a body of slight nakedness and humiliation and self-inflicted guilt. And I grew up learning to find where Waldo was in my books while hiding the guilt of my ignorance behind my 5-year-old eyes. But every time she would walk out in public, with bruises covering her body, dark spots under her eyes, scars across the highway of her back where his fingernails would dig into her skin, and where the crackle of a carnivorous creature would claw at within his whip, people would ask me, where did she get those? And I would reply, a game she played, for I'd been taught to see no evil. I grew up learning not to hear any evil, but my mother would always tell me to cover my ears with my hands as a little boy, just before she got into an argument with my dad. That way my palms would dull the sound of her agony as her voice attempted to swirl itself down within the drain pipes of my eardrums, rupturing the thoughts within my mind with every flush into my brain. And I would negate out all of her screams, as the voices down the hallway would drift themselves toward my 5-year-old earlobe, refusing to hear the sounds of ripping clothes and his gruff voice as he harassed her down to the floor, revealing a beaten body, abused with blotches of Cupid's anger on my father's thundering palm, clapping against the side of her face, leaving a red bruise of passion that he would later ask her to forgive him of, and where she used to live every moment for the sound of her name within his mouth. She came to realize that when he entered through the front door, I had to exit out the back. I grew up learning not to speak any evil, but my mother would always tell me to speak quietly and walk softly, as though I were in a library, teaching me that one man's weed was another man's flower. For you see, my mother was the weed that my father would light up and smoke with every strike against her skin, keeping himself on an insatiable high of infatuation that he had for the smell of her suffering, relishing the bittersweet taste of the salt within her tears as he kissed her face with lips full of unapologetic lies and empty promises. But to me, she was a flower. She was a flower that I would wash ever so slowly, wiping each wound and each bruise of Cupid's malicious arrows with little 5-year-old hands, trying to understand the violence in my father's love, with tears welling up in my eyes, matching the dimming stars of hope within her weak and watery ones, and with every shattered glass mirror smile that she would flash me with her chipped and crooked teeth, she would place her finger against my lips, and wiping away my tears would pull back the thread of the sky that separated the border of earth from the threshold of God, showing me that life could still be beautiful. You see, my father was a drunk. My father was a drunk who would drown his depression into the base of every glass of bourbon that he took. And he would toss that shot back into the back of his throat, as though it were a bullet being fired at the back of his brain. And he would place that glass down, and would fill it with another round from the stockpile within his whiskey barrel, and he would drink it more violently than before, as though the first shot had missed. And the second shot would do more damage than the next 2 rounds combined to effectively ensure that his memories would be destroyed in a liquid hailstorm of golden rounds, taking his self-restraint and dumping it into an urn of forgetfulness, and later a gourd of regret with every pull of the trigger of his 80-proof handgun, and the nightmares of the wailing and screaming within his memories would end as he stared at the invisible monsters floating about the smoking charred chamber of the bottom of his bottle. This he did for 15 years, taking my mother's sweat, blood, and tears as the source of his inner rehabilitation. He rolled the taste of power and bourbon around in his mouth until the walls in his heart collapsed after years of defending from every liquid bullet that would sear his organs. And that day would be the day that I would see my mother's face, hear my mother's voice, and speak my mother's name without the haze in my drunken father's eyes for the first time. Thank you. I got one more piece. Sure.